The general walked into the control room and saw the tattoo. He was mid-stride, 4 steps into a room he had entered dozens of times, classified briefings, operational reviews, the particular low-hum environment of a naval command and control center that never fully slept. His aide was 2 steps behind him. His security detail was already fanning toward the corners. He had a briefing in 11 minutes and a schedule that did not accommodate interruptions. He stopped, not slowed. Stopped. The way a man stops when something reaches through the noise of a full day and lands directly on a nerve he has been protecting for years. The IT technician in the gray work shirt was crouched beside an open server rack, his left forearm resting on his knee, the tattoo visible in the overhead light, a crude diamond intersected by a lightning bolt, faded to the particular blue-gray of old ink, looking to most eyes like a marking that belonged on a different kind of record than the one this facility kept. The general knew exactly what it was. He had seen it once before, at night, in a valley in Nangarhar province, on the forearm of the man who was carrying his brother through the dark. He crossed the room. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Elias Cole had been working the contract for 8 months. He came in at 7 and left at 4, the shift the hardware maintenance contract specified. He wore the same rotation of gray and navy work shirts, always clean and always slightly too large, which was a habit from years of wearing gear in environments where close-fitting clothes were a liability. He carried a black canvas tool bag organized with the precision of a man who had spent years in situations where not finding what you needed in the first 3 seconds was a meaningful problem. He spoke to the staff when spoken to. He greeted the security checkpoint officers by name, because remembering names was a habit he had never shed, and because it was the respectful thing to do. He did not linger. He did not socialize. He did not eat in the commissary or join the informal circles that formed around the coffee station at 10 and 2. He was not unfriendly. He was quiet in the specific way of a man who has learned, through years of high-noise environments, to conserve himself for things that actually require expenditure. Nobody in the Naval Command and Control Center knew who he was. Elias had retired from active service 22 months ago at 36, after a career that had begun in the conventional army, moved through the 75th Ranger Regiment, and then, after a selection process whose details were not available without a specific compartmented clearance, into a Tier 1 Special Mission Unit whose organizational existence was officially unacknowledged and whose operational record was classified above most flag officers. He had served in that unit for 11 years, 29 deployments, environments ranging from urban close quarters to open terrain to maritime and riverine, in climates from subarctic to equatorial. He had been a team member, then a team leader, then for the final 4 years, an element commander, the man responsible for planning and leading direct action missions that the chain of command needed to succeed and needed to be able to credibly deny. He had come home without significant physical injury, which was statistically unusual and which he attributed to detailed preparation and a willingness to abort operations that had gone irretrievably wrong rather than pressing forward out of momentum or pride. What he had come home with were not injuries in any clinical sense, but things that had reshaped him in ways he was still mapping. A permanent orientation toward exits in any room he entered. A resting attentiveness that other people sometimes experienced as intensity, and that was really the long-term residue of living in environments where inattention cost lives. A preference for quiet that was not shyness but something more deliberate, the preference of a man who had been operationally loud for a long time and had discovered in retirement that quiet was not an absence, but a condition he had been working toward without knowing it. The retirement itself had been unremarkable in the specific way that things are unremarkable when you have spent years operating in environments that made the ordinary world seem permanently altered. He had driven home from the processing center in a truck he had owned for 4 years and barely used, had unlocked his front door, had stood in the middle of his living room for a moment looking at the furniture, and then had gone to the kitchen and made coffee because it was morning and that was what you did in the morning. He had spent the first 3 months learning to sleep past 5. He had spent the following 3 months learning to sit in a room without cataloging threats. He had spent the following 6 months finding out what he wanted to do with the particular silence of a life that no longer had an operational structure inside it, and the answer he had arrived at, civilian hardware maintenance, methodical and technical and requiring a quality of patient attention that he found satisfying rather than dull, had surprised him slightly and felt entirely right. The tattoo had been done by a team member named Ferris in a forward operating base in Kandahar province on a night with no operations running and nothing to do except wait for the window. Ferris was not a professional tattooist. The design showed it in the slightly uneven diamond and the lightning bolt that wasn't quite centered, but he had done it with care, with materials that were technically not on the approved list and that neither of them had discussed with anyone above their pay grade. The mark was the unit's, not an official insignia, which did not exist in any official form, but the mark the team members had developed informally over years, the way informal symbols develop. A crude diamond, the 4 cardinal points of a mission, ingress, objective, egress, exfil, a lightning bolt through the center, direct action, fast, decisive, finished. To anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, it looked like exactly what Lieutenant Commander Vance called it. Vance had been assigned to the Naval Command and Control Center 6 weeks prior, transferred from a destroyer command that had been, by multiple accounts from people who served under him, a difficult billet for reasons that related primarily to Vance's management style and only secondarily to the operational demands of the posting. He was 34 years old, selected for 04 ahead of the standard timeline, which was an achievement that had confirmed for him something he had believed since his first command tour, that he was operating at a higher frequency than most of the people around him, that his perception of situations was more accurate, his judgment more reliable, his authority more legitimate. He wore his uniform with the slightly excessive precision of someone who had decided that appearance was a proxy for capability, and he processed the spaces he entered in terms of the hierarchy they contained and where he sat within it. He noticed Elias Cole on his second day. Noticed him the way a man who is attuned to hierarchy notices anything that doesn't fit his map of it, as an anomaly, something to be categorized and resolved. The gray work shirt, the tool bag, the quiet, self-contained way of moving through a high-security facility without appearing to seek permission from anyone. The tattoo, visible when the man's sleeve rode up while he was reaching into a server rack, looking from 15 feet away like something that belonged on a rap sheet rather than a security clearance. Vance filed it. He waited. The morning he chose to act was a Tuesday. The control room was busy. 2 watch teams rotating, a signals review underway, the ambient purposeful noise of a facility handling a significant operational support role. Elias was working on a rack in the far corner, running a diagnostic on a faulty network switch that had been generating intermittent errors for 3 days. Vance crossed the room with a cup of coffee in his hand and the particular bearing of a man who has decided that a situation requires his intervention. "Hey." Elias looked up from the rack. "What's that on your arm?" Vance said. The question was not a question. It had the shape of a question and the substance of a verdict already delivered. Elias looked at his forearm. He looked back at Vance. He said nothing. "I'm talking to you," Vance said. His voice had the carrying quality of a man who was aware of his audience without looking at it. The 2 watch officers at the main console, the petty officer at the signals board, the yeoman by the door. "That tattoo, what is that?" "A tattoo," Elias said. His voice was even and uninflected, the voice of a man answering the literal question rather than the implied one. "What does it mean?" "It's personal." Vance's expression shifted in the specific way of a man who has decided that he has been given an unsatisfactory response and is now escalating. He set his coffee cup on the nearest console. A petty officer moved it without being asked, with the instinct of someone who has worked in proximity to Vance long enough to anticipate, and stepped closer. "Personal," Vance said loudly enough for the room. "You know what that looks like to me? That looks like a gang mark. That looks like something that should have been flagged in your background check. Where are you from?" Elias looked at him for a long moment. Not a reactive look, not anger, not indignation, not the reflexive reaching for dignity that the question was designed to provoke. Just a look, patient and present, the look of a man receiving information about another man and filing it without yet deciding what to do with it. "I'm cleared for this facility," Elias said. "That's not what I asked," Vance said. He turned to the watch officer at the main console. "Petty Officer Gaines, what's the clearance protocol for civilian contractors with visible gang-affiliated markings?" Gaines looked at Vance, then at Elias, then at a point approximately between them, in the practiced way of someone who has learned that the middle distance is the safest place to look when a senior officer is doing something that feels wrong but requires confirmation before it can be objected to. "Sir, I'd have to check with the security officer on." "Get the security officer," Vance said. "Lieutenant Commander." Elias had not raised his voice. He had not changed his posture. He was still crouched slightly beside the server rack. "I have a DoD civilian contractor badge, a top-secret SCI clearance, and a SAP addendum that was verified at the entry checkpoint this morning. I've been working in this facility for 8 months. My clearance documentation is in the security officer's file. If you'd like to verify it, that's the process." Vance looked at him with the specific expression of a man who has been given a formally correct answer that he has decided to treat as insubordination. "Stand up," Vance said. Elias stood. He was not a small man, 6 feet, lean and economical in the way of someone whose body had been a tool for 2 decades and who had maintained it accordingly. He stood without ceremony and without performance, which was itself a kind of statement. "Turn around," Vance said. "I want to see the back of your neck." Something moved through the control room. Not audible. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved, but palpable, the way the pressure in a room changes when a threshold has been crossed. Elias did not turn around. "That's not a security protocol," Elias said quietly. "I'm making it one," Vance said. He reached out and put his hand on Elias's shoulder to turn him. Elias moved. It was not a visible thing, not in the sense of something that registered as deliberate action. What happened was that Vance's hand made contact with Elias's shoulder, and then Elias's center of gravity shifted by perhaps 4 inches in a direction that was not backward and not sideward, but something more precise and specific than either, and the result was that Vance's hand slid off the shoulder the way a hand slides off a wet surface, not deflected, not grabbed, just suddenly in contact with nothing. Vance stumbled 1 step forward, off balance, catching himself on the server rack with one hand. He had not been touched, not grabbed, not pushed, not blocked in any way he could describe to anyone afterward. He had simply reached for a shoulder and found that the shoulder was no longer where his hand was going. He straightened. His face had gone through something it was trying not to show. "That's assault," Vance said. His voice was compressed in a way it hadn't been before. "That's assault on a commissioned officer." "You touched me first," Elias said. "I am calling the military police," Vance said, "and you are going to be removed from this facility, and your clearance is going to be reviewed, and I am going to personally." The main door of the Naval Command and Control Center opened. Brigadier General Calvin Marsh, United States Marine Corps, came through the door with his aide and 2 security personnel. He was 53, compact and close-cropped, with the bearing of a man who had been in difficult environments for long enough that difficulty had become his baseline orientation. He had 3 rows of ribbons and a combat action ribbon that he wore without ostentation, the way people wear things they earned in circumstances that don't require advertisement. He had a classified briefing in 8 minutes and a mind already organized around it. He came through the door and his aide moved to brief him on the room status in the low, efficient register of a good staff officer. And Marsh was absorbing the brief while his eyes moved over the control room in the automatic sweep of a man who has walked into a lot of rooms in a lot of conditions. His eyes found the IT technician in the corner. They found the tattoo. They stayed there. His aide finished a sentence. Marsh did not respond to it. His aide registered the silence and stopped. Marsh crossed the control room. He moved with the directional certainty of a man who has fixed on a destination and has stopped calculating the route because the route is simply the shortest line between here and there. He passed Vance without acknowledgement. He passed the watch team without acknowledgement. He passed the signals board and the main console and the petty officer who had moved Vance's coffee. He stopped in front of Elias Cole. He stood there for 1 full second, looking at the tattoo on the forearm. Then his hand came up. The salute was not the brisk, functional acknowledgement that generals sometimes offer to convenience protocol in informal settings. It was a full, rigid, precise salute. The kind executed in the specific way that military training produces when the person executing it is doing it not because the situation requires it, but because the person in front of them has earned it in a way that overrides any consideration of the situation. It lasted 3 seconds. The control room had gone completely quiet. Elias looked at Marsh. Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise, not emotion exactly, but the brief, visible passage of something that had been carried for a long time and had just been for a moment acknowledged. He nodded once, with the contained precision of a man returning a communication rather than a performance. Marsh dropped his hand. He did not turn to address the room. He did not reach for drama or announcement. He simply looked at Elias and said, in a voice that was not raised and did not need to be, "It's good to see you." "Sir," Elias said. Marsh looked at the tattoo one more time. The diamond and the lightning bolt, faded and slightly uneven, looking from across the room like exactly what it had been called 20 minutes ago. He turned. He found Vance. Vance was standing 3 feet away, and the color in his face had undergone a significant change in the time it had taken Marsh to cross the room and deliver the salute. The color change was the particular kind that happens when a man has been moving at speed in a direction and has just discovered that the direction is wrong and the speed is a problem. "You're Vance," Marsh said. It was not a question. Marsh had been briefed on the room. He had made a habit over 3 decades of knowing who was in the rooms he entered. "Yes, sir," Vance said. "I heard what you said from the corridor." The quality of the silence in the control room changed. It had been the silence of people carefully not looking at something. Now it was the silence of people who understood that what they were witnessing was going to matter and had each made the individual calculation to stay very still. Vance said nothing. "That tattoo," Marsh said, "is the service mark of a Tier 1 direct action unit that does not appear in any organizational chart you have clearance to access." He said it at the same volume as everything else he said, which was the volume of a man who never needed to be loud because he was always the thing people were listening for. "It marks a combat operator. It marks an individual who has completed a qualification process that the conventional military does not publish, in a unit that the Department of Defense does not acknowledge, performing missions that your security clearance does not permit you to know the details of." He paused, not for effect, for the word to find the right place. "The man you called a thug," Marsh said, "once carried my brother 4 miles through Nangarhar province with a GSW to the femoral and a compound fracture of the tibia, in darkness, under intermittent contact, to a landing zone that had been designated as compromised, and that he reached anyway because the alternative was leaving my brother there." A pause. "My brother is alive. Because of this man." He looked at Vance with the expression of a man completing an equation rather than making an accusation. "That is what you called gang graffiti." The control room was as quiet as a room could be with live equipment in it. Vance stood with the posture of a man whose body had reached a decision about stillness before his mind arrived at the same place. "Sir, your section commander will hear from my aide before close of business today," Marsh said. "You'll address whatever that produces through your chain of command." He looked at Vance for one more moment, not with heat, not with contempt, with the flat informational expression of a man who has stated the available facts and has no interest in elaborating on them. "You're dismissed, Lieutenant Commander." Vance left. He left without speaking. He left the way people leave rooms when there is nothing left to do in them. Not walking out, exactly, but being somewhere else, the departure happening as a consequence of having run out of position to occupy. Marsh watched him go. Then he turned back to Elias, and the quality of his face changed. Not dramatically, but in the way that faces change when the formal part of something is over and the human part can begin. "I owe you a conversation I've been meaning to have for 2 years, Marsh said. "You don't owe me anything, sir," Elias said. "Patrick says otherwise." Patrick was the name of Marsh's brother. Elias had not heard it said out loud in 2 years, since the last time a member of the team had mentioned that operation in a context that wasn't operational. "Patrick's well," Elias said. "Teaching physical therapy in San Diego," Marsh said, "coaching his kids' soccer team, complaining about the traffic on the 5. He looked at Elias with the particular expression of a man who has internalized a debt he knows he cannot repay and has made his peace with it and still carries it anyway. "He talks about you. Not about that night specifically. He doesn't talk about that night to people who weren't there, but he talks about you." Elias looked at the server rack. He looked at his tools. "I was doing the job," he said. "I know," Marsh said. "That's what makes it the thing that it is." A beat passed between them. The specific silence of two men who have arrived at the edge of something that does not have language equipped to express it and are both experienced enough to recognize that the absence of language is not a problem. "How's the work?" Marsh said. He said it with a gesture toward the server rack, genuinely asking, the way a man asks who is interested in the answer. "Good," Elias said. "The hardware in this facility is well maintained, clear documentation. Most of the issues I find are intermittent connection errors, not fundamental failures. It's satisfying work." Marsh looked at him for a moment. "You're okay," he said. It was not a question or a reassessment. It was the specific kind of statement that emerges when a man has been carrying worry about someone and receives evidence that allows him to put it down. "I'm very okay," Elias said. Marsh nodded. He put his hand out. Elias took it. One shake, brief, in the grip of men who have something between them that a handshake is not equipped to hold, but is the right gesture anyway. "The hardware issue?" Marsh said, nodding at the open rack. "Faulty switch. Should be resolved in 40 minutes. "Don't let me hold you up," Marsh said. He turned toward the briefing room. His aide fell in. The security detail moved. Elias crouched back down beside the server rack. The control room returned to its rhythms in the way rooms return after significant events, not all at once, but in increments, individual workstations reconnecting to their tasks, conversation resuming in the low, purposeful register of a facility that has operational reasons to keep moving. Petty Officer Gaines, at the main console, looked at the open server rack and the man working quietly beside it. He had been in the Navy for 9 years. 3 facilities, 5 different officers, the accumulated experience of a man who had learned to read rooms with accuracy and to file what he observed in places where it could be useful or simply held, depending on what it turned out to mean. He had watched a Marine general salute a civilian IT technician. He was still processing the geometry of it, not what it meant specifically, which he understood he did not have the clearance or context to fully access, but what it felt like as an event in the room. It had felt like a correction, not a confrontation, not a revelation in the dramatic sense. A correction. The way you correct a measurement you've been making wrong, not with anger, but with the calm precision of a man who has located the source of the error and resolved it. He thought about the tattoo, which he had noticed on the contractor's first week, and formed no particular opinion about. He thought about it now differently, with the awareness that it was a thing he did not have the clearance to understand, which was itself information. His 9 years in the Navy had taught him that the things he couldn't access were often the most significant things. The classified programs, the operations that never appeared in the briefings he sat in, the personnel whose jackets were locked behind access levels he'd never held. The Navy was full of things that looked like nothing from the outside and were everything from the inside. He had simply never encountered one wearing a gray work shirt and replacing a faulty network switch in a corner rack. He thought about Vance. He had worked under Vance for 6 weeks and formed with the careful political intelligence of a petty officer who understood which thoughts to keep to himself, a detailed opinion. The small daily exercises of authority. The way Vance moved through the room as though the room were a mirror and he were checking his reflection in it. The specific quality of attention Vance gave to personnel who were below him in rank versus above, warm and attentive in one direction, crisp and assessor-like in the other. He thought about the 6 weeks, and then he thought about the last 40 minutes, and then he thought about the moment Vance had reached for the contractor's shoulder and what had happened. He had seen it from 12 feet away. He had watched Vance's hand make contact and then not make contact, and he had watched Vance stumble one step forward with the slightly disoriented expression of a man who reached for a door handle and found it on the wrong side. He had cataloged this and filed it without saying anything, because a petty officer who says the wrong thing at the wrong time about a senior officer's stumble is a petty officer who is looking for difficult postings. But he had seen it. He had seen what the contractor's body had done, which was nothing discernible, which was the absence of any discernible action that had produced a very specific result. He had been in the Navy long enough to know that that kind of nothing was never actually nothing. He had revised, in the moment the general saluted, every assumption he had not consciously been making. Which was the point, he supposed. The assumptions you didn't know you were making were always the ones that needed the most revision. He went back to his signals. The yeoman by the door, who was 22 and 6 months into his first posting, leaned over to the signals specialist beside him and said very quietly, "What just happened?" The signals specialist, who was 28 and had been in the Navy for 7 years and had served one posting in a facility adjacent to Special Operations Coordination, said, equally quietly, "I'll explain later. Just note that you saw it." The yeoman looked at the contractor in the corner, working on the server rack with the same methodical attention he had been applying for the last 2 hours, before any of the last 40 minutes had happened. "He doesn't even look," the yeoman started. "No," the signals specialist said. "He doesn't." That was the thing. He didn't look like anything other than what he presented himself as, a quiet man in a gray work shirt doing careful, methodical work on a server rack that needed attention. The general's salute had not changed that. The revelation of what the tattoo meant had not changed that. What Vance had said and what the general had said in response had passed through the room like weather passes through a landscape, significant while it was happening, leaving the landscape exactly as it was when it was done. Elias Cole picked up his diagnostic tool. He located the fault in the configuration, resolved it, ran the verification, and confirmed the fix. He replaced the switch panel and logged the maintenance completion. He picked up his tool bag. He was at the door when Gaines spoke. "Mr. Cole." Elias turned. Gaines looked at him for a moment across the control room with the expression of a man working out the right size for something. Then he nodded. A single, deliberate nod. Not a greeting, not a dismissal, but the specific gesture of someone who has revised their understanding of what they are looking at and wants the revision acknowledged. Elias nodded back once in the same register. He went through the door. He drove home on the county highway with the radio off. The Virginia afternoon moving past the windows at the speed of 60 miles an hour. Farmland and tree line and the occasional cluster of buildings that marked where a small town had decided to exist. He was thinking about Patrick Marsh in San Diego coaching soccer. He was thinking about the specific weight of a man in field gear over 4 miles of broken terrain in the dark, and how that weight had been the most concrete thing in the world in the hours while he was carrying it, and how it had become, in the years since, a thing he thought about less often than he might have expected and with less difficulty than he had initially feared. He had not done it to be remembered. He had done it because the man was there and the alternative was unacceptable, and those were the only parameters that mattered in the moment. The things you did under those parameters did not feel, in the doing of them, like the extraordinary things they became in the telling. They felt like the only available thing, executed with everything you had, with no margin for anything that wasn't the task. The salute had surprised him. not the fact of it. Marsh was a Marine general, and Marines saluted the things they considered worth saluting, regardless of protocol or audience. What surprised him was the timing of it, the full 3 seconds, in a room full of people who were going to carry the image of it. He thought about Vance. He thought about the specific look on Vance's face in the moment before the general turned to him. The look that arrived when the floor dropped away and a man discovered that the room he was standing in was organized differently from what he had assumed. He had seen that look before, in a different context. Not the specific expression of humiliation, but the specific expression of a map being revised under your feet while you're still standing on it. Most people survived it. Most people were better for it, given enough time and the willingness to let the revision actually land. He hoped Vance was the kind of person who could do that. He did not know. He would never find out. It was not his problem to solve. He pulled off the highway onto the road that led to his house, the trees on either side still holding their October leaves, the light coming through them at the angle that meant it was late enough in the afternoon for the day to be mostly over. He had dinner to make. He had a book on his nightstand he had been wanting to get back to. He had 8 hours of sleep ahead of him and a 7 o'clock start tomorrow, and a different rack in a different section of the control center that the hardware log said needed attention. Small, concrete, manageable things, the things that were there every day, whether the day contained a general's salute or not. He parked the truck and went inside. The tattoo on Elias Cole's forearm was faded and imperfect and had been done with equipment that was technically not on the approved list by a man who was not a professional tattooist, in a forward operating base in Kandahar province on a quiet night between deployments. It looked like nothing to most eyes. To one pair of eyes in a naval command and control center on a Tuesday afternoon, it had looked like something worth turning into a public confrontation. Worth a career's worth of authority deployed against a quiet man working on a server rack. The quiet man had not responded to any of it. He had not defended himself with words or credentials or the particular performance of dignity that the situation seemed to call for. He had simply remained what he was, present, patient, occupied with the task in front of him, and waited for reality to make its own argument. Reality, when it arrived, had done so in the form of a Marine general who had crossed a room and raised his hand. That was all it took. That was always all it took, for people who had built their lives on what they actually were, rather than what they could make other people believe about them. The server rack was fixed. The maintenance log was updated. The faulty switch was in the disposal bag in the back of his truck. Elias Cole drove home. The day was finished. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you're here for stories about quiet excellence and the people who carry the most without saying a word. Leave a comment below. Have you ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person? Tell us what happened when the truth came out.